The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Allow me to introduce you to the devil himself, Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper caused drama all through London in the late 1800s with his gruesome murders and heartless, cold actions. Though Whitechapel wasn't a stranger to murder and robbery and pimps, it was for grotesque actions. Now, there were several attacks on women that might have been early work from Jack the Ripper. These crimes are not dealt with in the article, or they don't dedicate no time to them because I guess they weren't sexy enough.
Jack the Ripper, serial killer, born unknown, victims 5 canonical, date 1888, location the East End of London.
The first official victim of the killer known as Jack the Ripper was Mary Nicholas, who was murdered on the 31st of August, 1888. She is the first of what is often referred to as the canonical victims, all who was murdered between August and November. Life was cheap in London 1888, especially for women.
Now we come to the first victim who was included in the canonical 5. She was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly to her friends. She was killed August 31st that same year. Yeah, that is a short time after the last murder, but as we said, those London slums were terrible places to live back then, so it's possible there were a few men who killed women in the East End in those months.
Martha Tammer's body was discovered at 5 a.m. on the first floor of the George Yard buildings. There is much debate on whether she was the true first victim of Jack the Ripper. You gotta understand that London 1888 is a filthy town filled with germs, filled with incest, filled with murder, and just a very dark place to live.
Then there was Martha Tabrum, an alcoholic who had a reputation for staying out all night and causing general havoc. On August 6, 1888, she and some other women went to the Angel and Crown pub and, as the expression goes, got hammered. She was later found dead, again with horrifying injuries. Those included being stabbed in her heart and lungs. The killer also stabbed her 9 times in the throat. The term overkill was suitable here, with 39 stab wounds on her body in total.
The body of Elizabeth Stride was found 1 a.m. at Dunfield's Yard. The fact that her throat had been cut, but the rest of her body had not been touched, led to speculation that her killer had been interrupted, had been stopped before he could finish his dirty deeds.
Again, it seemed the culprit had a mask of invisibility, but in the next murder, he might have basically done the deed right under someone's nose.
By all accounts of the witnesses, this took place in areas and times where somebody should have seen him. Both eyes wide open on this one.
Louis Dimeschutz had spent the day of September 29th selling his cheap jewelry. At the end of the day, feeling tired, he took his horse and cart back to Dutsfield Yard. Little did he know that as he approached the yard, the Ripper was mutilating a woman named Elizabeth Stride. Again, her life was full of tragedy, a story including dying children and a dead husband. Her misfortune led to her working as a prostitute, or at least on the days she couldn't afford to pay for her room in the slum.
The body of Annie Chapman, the second official Jack the Ripper victim, was found in the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street at 6 a.m. And yes, she was cut and scarred very hard too.
Then on September 8th, there was a grisly discovery of Annie Chapman. Her life was also a tale of woe. She had a problem with booze, which worsened after her daughter died, and she had to place her disabled son in care. Then her husband split with her and took the last child, and she ended up living in one of those run-down Whitechapel lodging houses.
Her story to me just reeks of wickedness and sadness. I believe this story right here explains just how down the people were at this time, just how dark of a place this was, and just how justice just wasn't a part of this place. Now, the body of Catherine Edwards was found in Mitre Square in the city of London at 1:45. This time, the savagery had increased, with the killer targeting the victim's face and going off with her uterus and her left kidney. Now, that's just some sick madness for somebody to cut somebody's body part off. Remember, this is 1888.
He killed Catherine Eddowes. She had been slashed over the face and had her throat cut. The autopsy report said the peritoneal lining was cut through on the left side and the left kidney carefully taken out and removed. I believe the perpetrator of the act must have had considerable knowledge of the position of the organs in the abdominal cavity and the way of removing them.
Keep in mind, most of this was done in a short period of time, so wrap your mind around that.
Still, it's long been disputed if such work required the skill of a surgeon. Some thought no, but the killer might have worked as a butcher. It was certain that all those mutilations might have taken around 5 minutes. Another doctor testified that when he arrived at the scene, she'd only been dead for about 40 minutes.
Then you got the body of Mary Kelly, found in her room in Miller's Court. She had been virtually skinned to the bone. Many experts believe that she was Jack the Ripper's final victim, and they also believe she was the one he had more time with because he was in there uninterrupted. And there he did some despicable stuff. There are plenty other victims that they thought was at the hands of Jack the Ripper was dismissed by some type of evidence. In July 1888, police Walter Andrew discovered the body of prostitute Alice Mackenzie in a dark thoroughfare of Whitechapel called Castle Alley. And that's not it. There was plenty other. The body of Francis Coles was found beneath a dark railway arch in Swallow Gardens. A few days later, the police charged a sailor by the name of Thomas Sadler. They couldn't connect him to the other murders, so of course, this went away quietly. Now let's get back to what is thought to be the last victim, the one that he had the most time with, the one that he gutted, the one that he skinned, the one that he did the most darkest things to the body.
When detectives discover the body, they send around a photographer. We get the first and only photographs of a Ripper crime scene. They're truly chilling. But they're also a powerful investigatory tool that we can deploy today. By using the scene of crime photographs and the really detailed notes taken by detectives who were there,
Okay, ladies and gents, here's another clue for you all. How can you operate in such a small space and do everything that this man did? So, one or two things had to happen. He had to drug her beforehand, or there were other people in on it. Shall we continue? Now, we can't rule out that she did scream and other people heard her, but you gotta understand that's very far-fetched, considering that somebody would have to do these murders in this small space, and in their mind just know that nobody's gonna call the police, or not call, this was back in the day, or run out to catch the police. Nobody was gonna start screaming, or better yet, come in there with a knife or some type of a gun. So I'm leaning towards they worked in a capacity that nobody heard them, or they had deals with people in that building, or the building itself was some type of hub for satanic activity. Then you'd have to say, how did the man get away with all that blood on him? Did he have some type of clothes under his outer outfit? Scientists and doctors was doing dark, horrible things back then as they are today in this day. Talking about your cloned animals. Scientists, as we speak, are trying to make it where a man can get pregnant. But you think this is beyond them? It's time to knuckle up and decide whose side you are and open up your eyes to the tricks, the many tricks of the devil, which the armor of God acts as a force field towards. Let's go. One more small clue with huge consequences. The paper was making money hand over fist with the Jack the Ripper articles. When examining cases like this, you have to be very careful and very mindful not to over-examine or under-examine. Everything has to be right in the middle so you can easily dismiss suspects. You have to be able to think logically, especially if the situation is way illogical. A lot of doctors was grave robbers operating on dead bodies.
To the modern mind, many of the medical treatments of the past may seem barbaric, cruel, and primitive. In a time when very little was understood about how the human body worked, diseases were often believed to be caused by evil spirits or bad luck, and treatments would often do more harm than good.
Nothing is as it seems. The old quote goes, believe half of what you see and none of what you hear. While examining the suspect, there's a few that keep coming up amongst the Jack the Ripper loyalists. Lawyer Montier John Druitt, surgeon turned lunatic Michael Ostrich, butcher turned lunatic Eric Kosminski, quack doctor Francis Termaletti, royal surgeon William Gold. But many more names have been floated, even Alice in Wonderland's author Lewis Carroll. But these people have one thing in common, most of them, they're all doctors and surgeons, or something to do with cutting up bodies. Let's go. Top 5 suspects, starting at number 5. John Druitt. He worked as a barrister and assistant headmaster. He committed suicide by drowning after he lost his job.
One of the reasons it was difficult to catch the man was the fact that those London streets in the 1880s were a giant labyrinth that were hardly well lit. Some of the slum areas were ripe for murder at night, seeing that prostitutes wandered around by themselves in the dark looking for gin-addicted clients. The area of Whitechapel, where the Ripper committed his ghastly crimes, was heaving in those days with people living in abject poverty. When folks couldn't get any work, some of them turned to crime. Many of the women turned to what's sometimes called the oldest trade in the world.
Number 4, Joseph Barnett. Joseph Barnett lived with Mary Kelly up until a few days before her murder. He worked as a fish porter and recently lost his job, and he struggled to pay rent with Kelly, and she was forced back onto the streets, something that he hated. He detested it.
In fact, in 1880, there were a total of 62 brothels and 1,200 prostitutes in this area alone. Some of these women lived in the lodging houses. These were about the cheapest places you could live. Some of the rooms even had a rope you could lean on as a form of bed. This was where we get the term hangover, because people would literally hang over a rope. The rope cost 2 pence a night, and while uncomfortable, it was better than the street and all the dangers that lurked there.
Suspect number 3, Francis Templeton. He was born in Ireland in 1863, but was raised in the United States. He gained a reputation for being a quack doctor for his dubious practices. In 1869, he ventured across the Atlantic to visit England. By his own admission, he roamed the streets till he knew them like the back of his hand.
After her husband died from his alcoholism, the little bit of cash she sent her was gone. She made money by doing odd jobs after that, but also prostituted herself when things got desperate.
Suspect number 2, Charles Lychmere. He discovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols on his way to work. He was shortly joined thereafter by Robert Paul. He showed him where the body was. Despite his closeness to the crime scene, police believe Lychmere to be an innocent passerby. But in recent years, people have changed their mind, and they speculated that he's the one that killed Nichols, but portrayed himself as somebody that just found the body.
At 5:15 a.m. that morning, a man heard a woman scream when he was walking along Hanbury Street. He didn't bother to investigate, and so yet again, the Ripper could have been caught if things had been a little different.
If he would have gave an actual damn. See, I'm just putting the hammer down on the nail and just nailing the point that this is a very uncaring, very dangerous place.
She was found at 6 a.m. nearby and hadn't been dead long. This is what one of the doctors said in his report. The instrument used at the throat and abdomen was the same. It must have been a very sharp knife with a thin, narrow blade and must have been at least 6 to 8 inches in length.
The number one suspect, Aaron Kosminski. The Whitechapel murder investigation was overseen by various high-ranking officers. One of them was the Assistant Commissioner, Robert Anderson. Anderson stated that Jack the Ripper had been identified. There was no doubt whatsoever as to the identity of the criminal. Without disclosing the name, Anderson described him as a low-class Polish Jew who was safely caged in an asylum. He had been identified by a witness who was described as the only person who had ever had a good look at the murderer, but he would not testify against him because he was a fellow Jew. Now, years later, in the 2000s, they did a DNA test and it went back to him.
It should be said, in those days, that was a lot of guesswork as compared to now, but still, doctors had a fairly good idea about the time of death in such cases. So the Ripper had committed 2 murders in a short space of time. He might have rushed the first one, seeing that he basically did it right under people's noses. Even with the second one, he could easily have been seen. That's when the killer really started to push his luck. He either began a correspondence with the police and press, or someone was playing a hoax. After these murders, a postcard was sent to the cops, and so was the famous From Hell letter, accompanied with a kidney. Part of the letter read, "I sent you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate, it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can." It might have been a hoax, but at the same time, those missives made Jack the Ripper case explode in the global media. As you know, there were only 2 more canonical victims, and there were perhaps some more victims too, but the Ripper really should have been caught the night he committed the double murder. As Dimeshoots later said, the Ripper must have committed the act only seconds before he arrived on the scene. He wrote, "It would have been quite possible for a man to have escaped from the yard while I was driving up to the club door, but after I had told the members what I had seen, nobody, I think, could have escaped." The cops speculated that the Ripper must have seen Dimeshoots approaching, and that's when he took evasive action. In fact, they said that when Dimeshoots lit that match, it's very likely the Ripper was standing nearby in the shadows. It must have been when Dimeshoots went to get that candle that he made the escape. Think about it, if Dimeshoots hadn't gone to get the candle and instead shouted something, all those people in the club would have come out and likely discovered the killer. The Ripper wouldn't have killed again, and the case would have quickly been written off as just another set of gruesome events in a place where people were used to that kind of thing.
We have a last and final suspect who goes by the first name No and the last name Body because he never existed. A theory first created by a man named Simon Wood, who was the first to admit that yes, Whitechapel murders happened. That's his only agreement with the history books. However, as he believes the notion of one killer of all the murders was one created by the police and the media. There are literally over 100 theories on Jack the Ripper's identity. No one even thought, it never occurred to anybody that this man never existed. Trevor Marriott also believed this. Marriott has spent 11 years reviewing the Ripper's killings and has gone deeper into Scotland's yard files than anyone before him, using modern police techniques and forensic analysts. Marriott believes the reason there are so many theories of the Ripper's identity is because over the years the facts of the case have been distorted. The general public has been completely misled by many authors and publishers. Jack is supposed to be responsible for 5 victims, but there were other similar murders before and after the ones attributed to him. both in this country, abroad, and in America and Germany. In total, Mary estimates there were 17 unsolved Ripper-like cases in England, Germany, and America. Some have speculated that Jack the Ripper moved around and continued his crime spree. The reality is there was just a series of unsolved murders that were gruesome and that people are truly sick. Now, you have to ask yourself, is Jack some type of an urban myth? Around 80% of the books about him have a picture of a chap in front stalking the streets of London in a long black cape and a top hat. They were clothes of the upper class, wealthy men. Back in 1888, if someone dressed like that in Whitechapel, they would be dead within 5 minutes. Now, out of all the outlandish theories, one that people choose to believe is Alan Moore's version, that Jack the Ripper was really Queen Victoria's physician, Sir William Gall, and the Whitechapel murders were part of Freemason occult ritual to enforce masculine dominance in the coming 20th century. And I am more prone to believe this theory other than the ones that are out there now. I believe this is a Satanist group, if anything, that dealt with witchcraft, as most of the doctors in the hospital of today do, and they was even worse back then. I think these murders was done in the name of science. In the beginning of this video, I said allow me to introduce you to the devil himself, and he's being unmasked. It's the same devil you've always known, nothing new under the sun. The same people who plot on you now, who play on you now, and yes, there are monsters among us, but these monsters are men. They move in silence. They move in secrecy. This is what we're dealing with. This was nothing more than a social engineering project. Both eyes wide open on this one, because Jack the Ripper wasn't a singular person. He was an idea. He was a movement. He was science. He was experimenting on live bodies, something they've longed to do, that they had to do in Cloak and Dagger. The same people who run the letter gangs all across the earth. The Dragon Order. The devil himself.